All right, so I had to make a second video because I didn't realize I was signed into the wrong account. So my video I was making last was winding down because when you're not using a paid account, they only give you 10 minutes. So you're just going to have to bear with me for the two videos. All right, but for this one, let's get started on this. So given that W and Y are right angles, what does that mean? So when they're right angles, it means they're 90 degrees. So that means we can put this box here to represent their right angles. And I put it in blue because although they're telling us they're right angles, we still needed to know exactly how to apply it. It then says Vx is congruent to Zx. Well, here's Vx and here's Zx. We know that they're congruent, right? Then it tells us that X is the midpoint. So we need to know what the midpoint of WY means. Well, here's the midpoint, and we know that when we have a point in the middle, it creates two congruent parts. So I know that these two are going to be congruent to each other. So you need to know how to apply midpoint. Now we look and see, well, we have a right angle. So let's see, we have a hypotenuse, and they are congruent. And these are our legs. So we know that we're going to say that these are congruent through HL. All right, so let's go ahead and start filling in this proof. So remember, when it's completely, you're doing it on your own, you're going to just fill in everything. So given that angle W and angle Y are right angles, all right, then I'm going to fill in all the rest of the given information to me. Vx is congruent to Zx, and X is the midpoint of WY. Right? I'm filling it all in one. And this whole number one is going to be given. Within this, I've talked about my legs already. I've talked about my hypotenuse already. So I'm going to put this H here just to remind me that I've already talked about this. Vx has already been discussed, so I don't need to talk about that anymore. Now, remember, anytime that you are using HL, what type of triangle do we have to have? We have to have right triangles. So this is a step that a lot of people will always forget. You need to talk about these right angles. So I will say triangle VWX and triangle ZYX are right triangles. Without saying this, you cannot get full credit because we cannot use hypotenuse without us knowing that it is a right triangle. So we will say that they are right triangles. Now, by saying that, our reasoning is, well, we knew what a right triangle was. We knew that right triangles mean that they have a right angle. So it is a definition of right triangles. So now I can cross this out because I discussed this. All right, now I'm going to have to scroll down because I don't have enough space. So all the given information was already written down, so we don't really need it anymore. All right, now the next thing that we haven't talked about yet is we haven't talked about our legs. So what I will do now is write those tick marks that WX is congruent to XY. And that's why I crossed things out, because since I crossed everything else out, I knew that this was what I needed last. So if I forget to cross things out, or if I'm not crossing things out, I might forget what I need to talk about. So this helps remind me, right? And this is my leg, so I will then say I talked about this. And how do we write that those tick marks were there? Well, we knew it because they said it was the midpoint of WY, so we knew what the midpoint meant. So it's definition of a midpoint. Once we talk about everything, we can then say that these triangles are in fact congruent. So we can say triangle VWX. Remember, whatever you're asked to prove is what you write last. Triangle ZYX, and then our reasoning is HL. All right, this one, given that N is the midpoint of AB and AX is congruent to NY and NX is congruent to BY, prove that angle X is congruent to angle Y. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about this. N is the midpoint of AB. So N is the midpoint, so I know it creates two congruent parts. So now I'm going to move on and talk to the next parts. It's flat out telling me that AX is congruent to NY, so I can put it in black. Then it tells me NX is congruent to YB. Once again, I can put it in black. Now I can prove that these two triangles are congruent through side, 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 something I knew. And once I prove the triangles are congruent, I can prove that any angle or side that corresponds is congruent. So now let's go ahead and fill in our T column chart. We have our statements. We have our reasons. First is always given. So N is the midpoint of AB. Then we can put in everything else. AX is congruent to NY, segment AX, and segment NX is congruent to segment BY. And all of this has a reason of given. All right, now I talked about these two sides, so I'm going to cross these out because this is what I discussed already. I'll cross out two of these S's. So now there's only one other thing I need to talk about, and that's this blue side here that I wrote. So now let me name this. This tick mark is segment AN. So segment AN is congruent to this tick mark, which is MB, segment MB. So now I will cross these out. That is my third side, so I can cross that out. My reasoning was, well, why did I say that? Since it's in blue, I knew what it meant. So how did I know that? It's because it told me it's the midpoint of AB. So we would use definition of midpoint. All right. So now that we said that they're congruent, I can then talk about congruent triangles. So when I name this, I'm going to do NAX. That means I went through one tick mark, through two, through three. So NAX is congruent to triangle. I need to do the same order, so I have to go through the one first. So it's NBY, triangle NBY. All right, now my reasoning I already knew here is side, side, side. And now let me look and see. Angle X and angle Y is what I want to prove. Well, X and Y are in the same spot. So since they're in the same spot, I can say that they're congruent. Angle X is congruent to angle Y, and our reasoning is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or CPCTC. All right, so let's go ahead and start marking what we know. We're asked, given that BC is congruent to segment BC is congruent to segment DC, and segment AC is congruent to segment EC. And we're asked to prove that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC. So we're trying to show, are these triangles congruent? Well, let's fill in the given information. BC is congruent to DC, and AC is congruent to EC. I can mark this in black because it was straightforward with what they were telling me. I don't need to think about that. It's just given. Now, it's something we've been doing for a while now, that we know these two angles are congruent because they're vertical angles. So I can put that in blue. Now, is there enough information for me to say, yes, side angle side, side angle side? So now I formulated my plan. So now let me go ahead and write everything out. So first thing that we do is our statements and our reasons. If you forget this, you will lose points. And then our first part is always what's given. So segment BC is congruent to segment DC, and segment AC is congruent to segment EC. All right, now these are the two sides. You don't have to do this. I'm just doing this so I can cross out these S's here, and I'm going to cross these tick marks out because I talked about it. And our reason is nice and easy. It's given. By putting it in black, it's not anything I needed to think about. How did I know that? It was given to me. Right, now I'm going to move on to the next thing. Well, the only thing left is this angle to talk about. So that's this angle. I can't just say angle C, because which angle am I talking about? There are 4 angles formed here, so you need to name it. Well, if we want to name this arc mark, we start with our side. Remember, it's side, vertex, side. So we start with our side. It doesn't matter B or A, but it's B, C, A. That gives us this angle that we're trying to look at. So it's angle BCA is congruent to, and now how do we name this other arc mark? E to C to D. It's side, vertex, side. So it's congruent to angle ECD. And then our reasoning for this, well, how do we know? We filled it in. It's in blue, so we knew it. Well, when these angles are across or opposite of each other, we know that they're vertical angles. So it's the vertical angles theorem. All right, and you can abbreviate this if you want to by vert, and then you can put the angle symbol, and you can do THM for theorem. All right, now this is our angle. So we talked about everything. We can cross out these blue arc marks, this angle, so now we're done. So all we have to do now is say whatever we're asked to prove. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC. And our reasoning for this is side angle side, something that we've already filled out. All right, now let's move on to the last question. All right, so now let's go on and move on to this number 6, the last one that you guys kind of giving you an idea of what the quiz may look like. All right, so it says I is the midpoint of segment CM and of segment BL. Well, what does midpoint mean? It means it's directly in the middle. So when it's the midpoint of CM, we can put these tick marks here because we know it's directly in the middle. It creates 2 congruent segments. When it's the midpoint of BL, we can also set these tick marks here. Now I'm putting them in blue because it wasn't flat out given to us that they are congruent. We needed to know what midpoint was. All right, then the last thing I know is, okay, we have these 2 sides. What else can I add? Well, we know these 2 angles, something we just did in the last question, that they're vertical, so we can put these arc marks. So now the same thing, through side angle side, I know I can say that these 2 triangles are congruent. So now let me just go ahead and fill in this chart. We have our statements, and we have our reasons. What do we write first? Well, first we always write what's given to us. So I is the midpoint of CM, and I is the midpoint of BL, and then that reason was given. So now I haven't talked about anything explicitly yet, so now we can discuss anything we want. I'm going to first talk about this one tick mark. So I'm going to describe these 1 tick marks. So it'll be CM is congruent to, I'm sorry, not CM. segment CI is congruent to segment IM. Right now, if I try to name this, I know the reason is definition of midpoint, and it's also going to be the same one for the next one. So rather than doing multiple steps for this, I can include these in once. So now I'm going to name these 2 tick marks because I know I got these tick marks all by the same reason. So it'll be segment LI is congruent to segment IB, right? And then I only need to write this reasoning once since it's for both of them. So it will be definition of a midpoint. So this is a side, this is a side. I'm going to cross out these tick marks as I talked about them, and I'll put X's under these S's. So the only thing left is the angle. Right now, I don't need to go through and name this like I did last one, side, vertex, side, because they put this 1 and this 2 here. I can just name them angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 because they named them for us. And why are we allowed to say that? Well, those 2 angles are vertical angles. So it'll be vertical angles theorem. And then that was our angle that we could discuss. So we could cross this A out, cross this out. And now we're done, or at least we can say that the triangles are congruent. So now we will say from 4, that triangle, let's go through 1 tick mark to 2. So it'll be CIL is congruent to triangle, 1 tick mark to 2. So it'll be MIB. And then our reasoning for this, as we already know, is side angle side. And now we're trying to prove that CL and MB are congruent. Well, CL and MB are in the same spot, so we can say that they are congruent. So segment CL is congruent to segment MB. And why is that? And it's because of CPCTC, that the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, that is it for these videos for this review. If you need any help, just let me know.